Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jen Flanagan Bradley. I graduated from Mercersburg in 1999, and I currently serve as the Director of Reunions at the school. It's wonderful to have you all here. I think we, at last count, had about 75 members of our community signed up to enjoy this wonderful tour today, calling in from all around the country, alumni, parents, friends, grandparents, and we also have some of our arts faculty members and our students, current students here today. So thank you for being with us. Without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to the Barnes Foundation so that we can get started on this wonderful tour. I want to thank and introduce Colleen Delaney, who's been our point of contact. And she's going to give us some further information and instructions and introduce our docent, Joe Cliva. So turning it over to you, Colleen.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm Colleen Delaney. I'm the sales manager for groups and events at the Barnes Foundation. I'd like to take this time to welcome you to our brand new virtual tour platform, Barnes Live. Our sincere thanks to Mercersburg Academy for supporting the Barnes in this new venture. Education is at the heart of everything we do at the Barnes Foundation. Since 1922, our mission has been to promote the advancement of education and the appreciation of fine arts and horticulture. Our founder, Dr. Albert C. Barnes, believed that art had the power to improve minds and transform lives. Our diverse educational programs are based on his teachings and one-of-a-kind collections. These virtual tours are a new interpretation of the Barnes mission and an effort to evolve in this changing world. Today's program is a quick look at our world-famous collection, but it's just a taste of what we offer at the Barnes. Stay tuned for more information about our classes and programs at the end of the tour. On the right side of your screen, you will see a section labeled Art Chat. Please use this space for comments, reactions, and questions throughout the tour. I will compile these questions for Q&A during the last 10 minutes of the program. Now I'd like to introduce you to your docent for the program, Joe Cliva. Joe is a multidisciplinary artist and graduate from the University of Arts in Philadelphia, where he studied music and graduated with a master's degree in music education and a bachelor's in classical composition. Spending most of his career as a teacher and multi-instrumentalist, Joe later added other disciplines to his artistic palette, such as photography, graphic design, drawing, painting, and theater production. Joe also enjoys studying philosophy, languages, and science, and he proudly became a docent at the Barnes Foundation recently, adding another outlet through which he can continue to teach and share his passion for the arts. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Colleen. So good to be here, and thank you to everyone at the Mercersburg Academy, all the alumni there and current students, faculty, and parents. It is really my pleasure to be here today, and I'm thrilled to be giving you this tour on this virtual platform here at the Barnes. Now, I do know that nothing beats being at the Barnes in person, walking through our galleries and seeing the magnificent pieces in the collection up close and personal. But during this tour, I'll do my best to give you some history of the Barnes Foundation, and Dr. Barnes himself, talk a little bit about the unique way the art is displayed in our galleries, and highlight some of the most exceptional pieces in the collection, just as I would if this were a live tour. So let's get started. I'd like to start with just a brief history of the Barnes Foundation, so you have some idea of what makes it different from other art museums or galleries that you may have visited in the past. First, the Barnes Foundation is actually a private collection of art that was secured by Dr. Albert C. Barnes over about a 40-year period between 1912 and 1951. He chartered the Barnes Foundation as an educational institution in 1922, about 10 years after he started collecting. That same year, in 1922, he purchased a 12-acre arboretum in Marion, Pennsylvania, which is about 9 miles from the current location in Philadelphia. And he hired an architect by the name of Paul Philippe Cray to design a residence for he and his wife and his faithful dog Fidel to live, and a gallery to hold his burgeoning art collection. This is the original building in Marion, Pennsylvania, and it was completed in 1925, about 3 years after Barnes first commissioned it. The collection was housed here for over 80 years, but in 2012, in order to better serve Dr. Barnes's educational mission, which we'll talk about more a little later, the collection was moved to its current location in Philadelphia. This new location is right down the street from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It's right across the street from the Rodin Museum. It's just a couple blocks away from the Franklin Institute. So this was a good move. It's in an area now that's much more accessible to a lot more people. Also, the collection is displayed in this new location exactly as Dr. Barnes left it in the original gallery at the time of his death in 1951. That's going to be important to remember for reasons that you'll learn a little later. And finally, this new building was designed by architects Todd Williams and Billy Chen. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this handsome fellow. This is Dr. Albert C. Barnes, many, many years ago. He was born right here in Philadelphia in 1872. And as a child, he did have an interest in art and showed some talent as an artist. But by the time he got to high school, he decided to pursue more academic subjects instead. He attended high school at Central High School, which is very close to here in North Philadelphia. And while he was there, he became friends with another student who happened to be an artist by the name of William Glackens. Now, I kind of jokingly tell everybody that this is not William Glackens' high school photo, but keep his name in mind because he's going to come up again later in our conversation. He played a major role in Barnes's passion for art collecting many years after they graduated high school together. So after high school, Barnes obtained a degree as a medical doctor from the University of Pennsylvania. But he never practiced. He never became a physician or practiced medicine. Instead, he pursued pharmacology. And along with a chemist by the name of Herman Hill, he created an antiseptic which they called Argerol. Argerol was used to treat and prevent newborn infant blindness. Now, Argerol made Barnes a very rich man. In fact, in 30 years after he invented Argerol, he sold the Argerol company in 1929, right before the big famous stock market crash of that year. And the proceeds that he made from the sale of the company allowed Barnes to never have to work again, enabling him instead to concentrate on his passion for art collecting. So if we jump back now from 1929 to 1912, that year, Barnes reconnected with his old Central High School friend, William Glackens. And by this time, Glackens had established himself as one of the foremost illustrators and painters in America. Also during that year, Barnes was becoming increasingly more interested in art. And he saw his rekindled friendship with Glackens as an opportunity. So later in 1912, he gave Glackens a $20,000 line of credit and sent him to Europe to purchase as many works as he could that were the best examples of modern painting at the time. So Glackens took the money, he headed to Paris, and he returned with 33 paintings, many of which are still on display in the collection today. They included works by Renoir, Pissarro, Denis, Van Gogh, Sisley, Le Bourg, Picasso, and Paul Cezanne. Today, there are thousands of pieces in the collection, not just paintings. The collection also includes African masks, Native American jewelry, Greek antiquities, and decorative metalwork. Most notably, there are 181 works by Auguste Renoir, 180 paintings and one sculpture. It's the largest collection of Renoirs in the world. There are also 69 works by Paul Cezanne, 59 works by Henri Matisse, and 46 works by Pablo Picasso. Now, I mention those four artists because Barnes referred to them as the four pillars of the collection. From left to right on your screen, that's Auguste Renoir, Paul Cezanne, Henri Matisse, and Pablo Picasso. There's hardly a gallery in the collection that you could walk through and not see several works by one or all of these gentlemen. Okay, so getting back to the original paintings that Barnes received. When he first looked at these paintings, something funny happened. He wasn't sure that he liked them. In fact, there were a few paintings that he was positive he didn't like. Those are the paintings that are probably not still hanging in the collection. But this perplexed Dr. Barnes. He immediately thought that this was some sort of scientific problem that needed to be solved. What was he not seeing that everybody else was seeing? So, being a man of science, Barnes starts to think of a scientific, objective way to look at art in order to gain a greater appreciation of it. He tries to think of an equation or formula or method to help him better appreciate and understand the art in his collection. Now, being a chemist, Barnes was very familiar with the chemical periodic table of elements, but what he learned was that there is also a table of elements in art. As you can see here, I think my slides jumped ahead a little bit too fast, but this is the artistic table of elements, if you will. And they consist of things like line, shape, color, pattern, texture. I heard before we started the presentation today that there are several art students from Mercersburg Academy attending, so I'm sure many of you art students are familiar with these elements. And that artists use these elements and combine them in different ways to illustrate an idea or express a human quality. Or sometimes they're just combined for different decorative purposes. Barnes thought that by concentrating on these elements when looking at art, it could help him and other people understand and appreciate art more thoroughly. Barnes decided to concentrate on what he considered to be the four main elements of art, which are these: color, light, line, and space. Dr. Barnes thought that by using these four elements, a viewer can obtain the vocabulary needed to evaluate, analyze, explore, and enjoy art more thoroughly. So let's see how he did that by using one of the pieces in the collection. This is a work in the collection by one of the four pillars, Pablo Picasso, and it's titled The Ascetic. It was painted in 1903 during what was called Picasso's Blue period. So let's start by looking at the element of color. Now, during this period, Picasso pursued themes of suffering and alienation. The subjects of his paintings during this period were very often the sick, the blind, the imprisoned, and other marginalized people with whom Picasso greatly identified himself during the early years of his career, while he was also struggling. The color blue is described by many artists as a very cool color. So using so much of it, like you see in this painting, in my opinion, expresses a feeling of coldness, or sadness. In fact, we use the term "I'm feeling blue" when we are feeling sad. So I think Picasso's predominant use of the color blue in this painting is for obvious reasons. Let's take a look now at how he uses the element of light. If we look at the shadows he painted, we can tell that the light is coming from the man's right side, casting this large shadow on the wall behind him. And most notably, the really dark shadows on his cheeks, under his cheekbones. I think Picasso purposely placed the light where he did for a very specific reason, to further illustrate this man's frailty and those dark shadows in his hollow cheeks. Let's move on to how Picasso uses the element of line in this painting. The lines of the man's body are drawn very long and narrow, making the figure look emaciated, with a sunken torso and extremely long, thin arms. Also, the way the man is seated or posed make his arms and body form very straight vertical lines. And if we look at the edge of the table where he's sitting, that forms a very straight horizontal line. This is important to point out because artists use vertical and horizontal lines to make a subject look static or still or lacking energy, which is very appropriate, obviously, in this case. But I also find it interesting that Picasso uses line to paint the man's neck so thick, with these additional lines in his neck that show his musculature. I think maybe Picasso did this to show that the man was once strong or viable before life took its toll on him. And finally, let's look at how Picasso uses space in this painting. That shadow on the wall that I mentioned earlier illustrates that the wall is directly behind the man or the figure, placing him in a very shallow space between the wall and the table. I feel that that conveys the quality of confinement or even claustrophobia. The man seems wedged between the wall behind him and the edge of the table in front of him, maybe even trapped there. In fact, when you look at the painting, you can't see where the table ends. There's literally no end in sight. So, okay, let's try this evaluation with a different set of paintings. Maybe something a little happier. These two paintings here are both by another one of our four pillars, Auguste Renoir. And both are simply titled Landscape. But the one on the left was painted in 1917, and the one on the right was painted between 1900 and 1905. Before we talk about color, light, line, and space with these paintings, I think it would be interesting to compare these two paintings to each other. Renoir was considered an Impressionist painter, and the Impressionism style was characterized by a break from the hyper-realistic traditions of the Renaissance period, or the Baroque, the Neoclassical, and other periods. Impressionists concentrated instead on the exploration of the effects of light on color and using freer, looser brushstrokes. These two paintings are both great examples of the Impressionist style. But looking at the painting on the left, you can see how much more impressionistic Renoir made this landscape compared to the painting that we saw on the right, which he painted 15 years earlier. The interesting thing about this is that it's believed that Renoir was trying to move away from Impressionism later in his career. But the brushstrokes are so much thicker in this painting that we saw on the left, which is 15 years later than the one that was on the right. There's so much less fine detail. It's a lot more impressionistic. However, we can still tell we're looking at a beautiful landscape with a stream and a tree line. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a closer look at Renoir's use of the element of color in these paintings. Now, in contrast to the Picasso we just saw, Renoir uses a much broader palette of colors. There's no one predominant color like we saw in the Picasso. I've been a musician all my life, and in musical terms, I would describe the Picasso as being similar to a string quartet or a jazz trio, only using a few instruments. These Renoir landscapes, in musical terms, I would describe as a symphony of colors. The use of this broad palette of colors, in my opinion, expresses vibrance, vitality, and life. Okay, so let's look at his use of light. Now, again, unlike the Picasso, we can't determine the direction from which the light is coming in these paintings because Renoir didn't include any shadows. This creates the feeling that the light is all-encompassing and surrounding everything. Moving on to Renoir's use of line. Again, in contrast to the Picasso, instead of long, straight, narrow, vertical, and horizontal lines, Renoir uses much shorter diagonal lines. You can see this in the trunks and the branches of the trees that are in the middle ground of the painting. And in the background, you can see it with the skyline of the trees and the mountains. In the foreground, you can see it with the direction of the stream and the angle of the grass line. All of these diagonal lines create a wonderful sense of movement or motion, energy, and life. They lead the viewer's eyes in all different directions around the canvas. And finally, let's look at Renoir's use of space in these paintings. Again, in contrast to the Picasso, these paintings illustrate a deep space. Through his use of linear perspective, with the stream in the painting on the left and the path of the trees in the painting on the right, as well as his use of what we call atmospheric perspective, which is how you see the trees slowly starting to blend into the sky or the mountain range the further away they get from us. Renoir creates a space that feels almost infinite, making the viewers feel as though they're looking back as far as their eyes can see. Okay, let's try this with one more painting. This piece is titled, simply enough, Woman on a Red Sofa, and it's by, yet again, one of our four pillars, Henri Matisse. Matisse painted this work between 1919 and 1920 when he would have been around 50 years old. Let's look at how Matisse uses color with this painting. Now, like Picasso, Matisse also uses a predominant color, but in this case, it's red, which gives a completely different emotion or feeling or vibe. In contrast to blue, red is considered a warm color, and it expresses life or passion. Matisse does use some blue in this painting, but more as a complementary color to the red, and to add a little contrast. For example, in her dress and on the vase on top of the dresser. Okay, let's move ahead and look at his use of light. Now, similar to the Renoir paintings, the light is coming from everywhere in this painting. We can't determine the direction of the light because there aren't any shadows at all. If any of you are photographers or videographers, you know that this type of lighting is referred to as high-key lighting. It makes the image brighter, and it's much more flattering to the subject because it removes all the shadows that highlight things like wrinkles and crow's feet. But I also think that it expresses a feeling of being bathed in light. Okay, let's move on to Matisse's use of line. Matisse uses many diagonal lines in this painting, similar to the Renoir paintings. And that gives it a sense of life or motion. In contrast to the Picasso portrait and the way Picasso had his figure posed, this woman is posed and seated diagonally. Even the sofa is painted on a diagonal slant. The top of the dresser forms a diagonal plane. Even the blue that he has painted in her dress form additional diagonal lines. But I think the most interesting use of line in this painting is the repeated line patterns throughout the carpet that are surrounding the subject. This pattern of swirly lines in the carpet surround the subject even more with a feeling of movement and energy. And the pattern moves across the painting from left to right, which in effect moves your eyes around the canvas as well. And finally, let's look at how Matisse uses space in this painting. Now, similar to the Renoir paintings, Matisse uses some linear perspective to create a sense of deeper space behind the model. But similar to the Picasso, it's also an indoor scene. But the space is nowhere near as shallow, so we don't get that sense of being trapped. So just for fun, let's take a look at all four of the paintings that we just looked at the same time. When we look at different paintings grouped together like this, it changes the dynamic or the characteristics of the individual paintings. In this grouping, all that red in the Matisse painting actually complements and balances all the blue in the Picasso. The diagonal lines in the Matisse balance the horizontal and vertical lines in the Picasso and add a nice contrast. The Renoir paintings add more colors and energy to the indoor seated scenes in the Matisse and the Picasso. The deep space in the Renoir paintings create a nice contrast to the more shallow spaces in the Picasso and the Matisse. We could spend a lot of time together coming up with different discoveries in this grouping. And the fun part is that people notice or discover different things. Now, Dr. Barnes realized this and he got an idea. Why not hang the paintings on the wall like this? And while I'm at it, I'll add my own sense of deeper space by placing some three-dimensional objects on the wall, like this bench, which also looks like it could be the bench on the other side of the table across from the man in the Picasso painting, which, by the way, creates a visual connection with that painting. These wood bird sculptures, which look like they could have come out of these nature landscapes, again, creating more visual connections. This copper pot, which looks eerily similar to the pot in the Picasso painting, add some decorative metalwork, and all of a sudden you have what Dr. Barnes called an ensemble. Now, the word ensemble is probably more familiar if you've ever talked about music or if you're a musician. It's used to describe a group of musicians or a group of instruments. For example, an orchestra is an ensemble. A choir or chorus is an ensemble. A jazz quartet is an ensemble. And the instruments in an ensemble each have their own characteristics. A violin, for example, is very lyrical and melodic. A trumpet is very majestic sounding and strong. A clarinet is very somber and mellow. But when you combine those three instruments, it changes their dynamics, their individual characteristics, because they create harmony. And that harmony is what changes those characteristics and takes on its very own dynamic or characteristic. That's what Dr. Barnes is doing here, combining the individual characteristics of these pieces and creating a visual harmony. Now, some of these ensembles in the collection, like this one, are relatively small and consist of only a few pieces. We actually see here that this ensemble only takes up about half of one wall, with a different ensemble on the other side. Other ensembles, however, take up an entire wall, like one of my favorites, which is in Gallery 14, which is right through this door. So let's head in there and check it out. So, okay, as you can see right away, this is a much larger ensemble, taking up an entire wall. But similar to the last ensemble we just viewed, and similar to most of the ensembles throughout the collection, this one has one large, what we call an anchor painting in the center, and the rest of the pieces are sort of symmetrically arranged around it. Before we talk about this ensemble and wall, I think it would be interesting and fun to imagine what this wall would look like in a more traditional art museum or gallery. So through the magic of technology, we can see here that what this wall might look like in a more traditional museum. One singular row of paintings hung in a straight line, a lot of negative space on the wall, information placards hung next to the paintings, and no other types of art or artisanry placed around the paintings. But let's bring Dr. Barnes's wall back to compare. Now, at first glance, when you see all these paintings, it might be a little overwhelming, like it was for me on my first visit, and it might just seem like a disorganized mess. But when you start to look closer, you'll notice there's a beautiful symmetry and organization to the way the work is displayed. Instead of only one row of paintings, there are four, starting with the chairs and wood chest on the bottom row, a row of larger canvases above that, a third row above that of smaller canvases, and a fourth row above that of metalwork. Now, the reason for the inclusion of the metal and woodwork is that Barnes appreciated the work of artisans as much as he did artists. And he believed that visual connections can also be made between artisans' work and these paintings. You might have also noticed that there are no information placards placed on or around the art. Dr. Barnes learned that when most people visit a museum, they spend more time reading the information placards than looking at the art. So what did he do? He got rid of them. Barnes didn't want the viewers in his galleries to concentrate on who painted something or why they painted it or what they used to paint it. He wanted his viewers to view all the works in an ensemble as objects that all somehow relate to one another, forcing them to think critically and to look deeper into how an artist uses color, light, line, and space to manipulate the paint or whatever their medium is to create these works of art. It's why you might have also noticed that there are many different artists represented in a single ensemble, and there's art from many different centuries, all kind of grouped together. So let's take a closer look at this wall by starting with that large anchor painting right in the center. This painting is by a French artist named Henri Rousseau. It's titled Scouts Attacked by a Tiger, and it was painted in 1904. Interesting thing about Rousseau, he was a self-taught artist, and he created these enormous jungle scene paintings like this one by studying the plants and taxidermy animals in Paris's natural history museums. During this time, France was at the height of its colonial period, most notably with colonies in West Africa. And works like this were popular with Parisian audiences for their theatrical presentation of France's faraway, exotic, and violent territories. It was the only way most people in Paris got to experience these faraway places. It was sort of like their social media or Instagram. With this painting, I think it's very interesting to note how Rousseau combines the elements of color and space, actually using color to create a sense of deep space. Let's take a look at how he did that. All of the green in the painting, particularly in the blades of grass, are closest to us in the foreground, or as we might say, closest to the picture plane. Behind that, he creates another layer of blacks or super dark greens to create a middle ground and draw our eyes back even further. And finally, behind that, this other layer of light blue, which creates a background and an even deeper sense of space. I mentioned earlier that Rousseau's paintings were very theatrical. And I think that that quality or characteristic in his paintings is achieved in large part by the way he uses the element of light. Now, we can tell by the moon that's you see painted very lightly behind the tree line, the bright blue sky, and the way that the trees are silhouetted, that the light source is coming from behind the subjects. Yet, it seems that the tiger and the scouts are well lit from the front. Waiting for my computer to catch up with my tour and show you some lines here. If this was a photograph, this effect would be achieved by placing a flash or several flashes on the camera in front of the subjects. In theater, it's achieved with stage lighting. So this is sort of a great example of how artists manipulate the elements like light to achieve their goals or vision. There they were. Let me just go back here. I'll show you some of these lines that didn't show up right away. So here's the direction that the light is coming from behind the trees. And again, with these arrows here, you could see that the subjects are lighted from the front. So again, this was just shown to show you how artists manipulate the elements when it serves their vision. Okay. Now, when I look at this painting, I feel a huge sense of energy. And I think that's because of Rousseau's use of line. We spoke earlier about how diagonal lines create a sense of motion or energy by directing your eyes all around the canvas. Look at all the diagonal lines of this painting. The sharp angle of the tiger, the mirrored angle of the horse, the upward diagonal thrust of the horse, all the blades of grass. This is a very violent scene. So I'm sure this extensive use of diagonal lines was chosen to illustrate that. Now, I'd like to go back to our table of artistic elements for one moment to talk about an element we skipped over before, and that's this one in the lower right-hand corner. Unity and variety. See the use of this element when an artist takes one small part of the painting, like we saw in the Matisse painting, The Woman on the Red Sofa, and repeats it all around the canvas, which in turn unifies the whole scene in the painting and makes it more interesting visually, especially since every repetition is changed slightly. Now, if we go back to the Rousseau painting, we see clearly that the repeated motif in this work is the blades of grass, or the leaves and branches of the trees. They run throughout the painting, from left to right and top to bottom. This again moves your eyes all around the canvas. And all of these repeated motifs around the canvas unify the entire painting. And yet, there are no two blades of grass or no two leaves stated in exactly the same way, making the painting far more interesting visually. So let's see how Dr. Barnes applies these same elements that we found in this Rousseau painting to his entire ensemble. First, let's look at the arrangement of the pieces around the Rousseau. If we look at the paintings above and to the left and right of the Rousseau, as well as the wood chest beneath it, we can see that they are arranged in this beautiful symmetrical shape, forming invisible diagonal lines, like those in the Rousseau painting. In fact, if we look at the wood chest and the top painting with the furthermost paintings on the left and right, they form an even larger diamond shape and longer invisible diagonal lines. If we bring back those lines showing how the objects in the ensemble are arranged in 4 rows, we see that they're not placed in straight lines, but staggered in order to create even more invisible diagonal lines, which effectively move the eyes of the viewer back and forth, left and right across the wall and the entire ensemble. Now, I should pause here for just a second to mention that these observations that I'm making about this ensemble or the wall or the individual pieces on it are all my own. One of the most fascinating things about Dr. Barnes's method is that he didn't leave behind any manuscripts or guides explaining his thought process concerning the arrangement of these ensembles. I believe that Barnes did this, as he did many things, on purpose, to force the viewers to think critically and to arrive at their own conclusions or hypotheses about the pieces and their relationship to each other. For example, I don't know if Dr. Barnes did this intentionally or not, but as I look around this wall, I can clearly see repetitions or variations on a motif that unify this whole ensemble, like we discussed in the Rousseau painting. Starting with this Radon painting all the way to the left, one of the first things I noticed was that beautiful white stallion just expressed so incredibly on this canvas. Next to that painting and to the right, in this painting by Veronese, one of the first things I noticed was the beautiful white dove above the figures in the bottom half of the painting. To the right of that, and up a little bit higher, in this painting by Paul Cezanne, it's very small, but you see a bird in the bird cage. I think by now you might be starting to guess what this repeated motif might be. A little further to the right in the Rousseau painting, we already observed the animal motif is repeated once again with the horse and the tiger. To the right of that, in this painting by Gustave Courbet, the animal motif is repeated again with these 2 lovely white doves. And finally, all the way to the right of the wall, in this painting by Auguste Renoir, we see the repetition of the motif once again, but varied even further with that small dog standing on the dock. So I believe Barnes intentionally applied the element of unity and variety to this entire wall, and not just in the paintings. If we look at the metalwork, the sculptures and the designs painted on some of the woodwork, we see even more repetitions of that animal motif. For example, in this metalwork above the Cezanne painting, this clearly looks like a bird in flight, but it is actually 2 separate pieces of metalwork, a door hinge and a key plate, cleverly placed together to form what looks like a bird. Okay. I'm not sure how you feel, but I think it's so much fun to make these discoveries using these techniques and this language which Dr. Barnes helped us to learn. And you can do this on all 4 walls in all 23 galleries in the collection. Sadly, we don't have enough time to do that today, but what I would like to do right now is just take a short break from the art to tell you a little bit more about the history of Dr. Barnes, in particular, his educational mission, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. Around the same time that Dr. Barnes started collecting art, he became very interested in education, mainly as a result of following this man, Dr. John Dewey. Dewey was an American philosopher, a psychologist, and an educational reformer whose ideas were very influential in education and social reform at that time. He believed that education was fundamental to democracy and a democratic society. The two met at a seminar at Columbia University in 1917. They became close friends and collaborators spanning more than 3 decades. Barnes was so moved and inspired by Dewey's philosophy that he began teaching classes on art and philosophy to his co-workers at the Argyrol factory before he sold it. Later, after moving into the residence at the Arboretum in Marion, Pennsylvania, he expanded his educational mission to more people and began holding classes right inside of the galleries. Barnes referred to his ensembles and walls in the gallery as teaching walls, using them almost like blackboards to teach his students about his philosophy of art. This focus on education is still, to this day, one of the core missions of the Barnes Foundation. Classes are still offered on many different topics in art. Colleen mentioned this at the start of the presentation today, and she'll speak a little bit more about it after my presentation. But the classes are wonderful. The teachers are fantastic. So if you're interested in taking a class, I encourage you to go to the Barnes website, barnesfoundation.org, and check out a few of them. Okay. Around the same time that Barnes met Dewey, he also became very interested in African art. In fact, between 1922 and 1924, he made 5 large purchases of African art from this man, Mr. Paul Guillaume, who was a collector and a dealer in Paris at the time. As I mentioned earlier, around this time, France was at the height of its colonial period, and many artists and art dealers took advantage of the ease of travel between France and areas like the Ivory Coast of West Africa to study the art from those native cultures. Or, as in Paul Guillaume's case, collect and sell it. Barnes took the more than 120 African works he purchased from Guillaume and arranged them and displayed them in the Foundation's galleries. He was one of the first people in the United States to do this, to collect and display African objects as works of art, not just ethnographic specimens. He thought of African art as an advanced art form, not a primitive one. He considered African art the purest expression of three-dimensional form and ranked it among the world's great art traditions. Let's take a closer look at some of the other pieces of African art in the collection. This is the south wall in Gallery 22. We notice right away how Dr. Barnes made the anchor piece of this ensemble this display case containing 18 examples of African art from the Ivory Coast. We can see very clearly the characteristic similarities in all of the pieces, in particular with the masks, the almond-shaped heads, the pointed chins, the elongated necks, slender noses, almond-shaped eyes, and elongated bodies. All of these characteristics were very common in the art from the West African Ivory Coast. And the artists who had the chance to study it were greatly influenced by it, as we can see in some of the pieces in this ensemble, starting with these two paintings by Pablo Picasso. The painting on the left is titled Head of a Woman. The one on the right is titled Head of a Man. Both were painted in 1907. And you can see very clearly how Picasso is drawing inspiration from the abstracted geometric forms of African art. Similar to the masks and sculptures we just observed in this room, in that display case, the heads have almond-shaped eyes, these slender, elongated noses, foreheads peaking in a sharp point. Another painter that was heavily influenced by African art was an artist by the name of Amadeo Modigliani. And we can see in these two portraits by Modigliani that were painted a few years after the Picasso portraits. The painting on the left is titled Madame Anka Zborowska leaning on a chair. He painted that one in 1919. The portrait on the right is titled Portrait of Jean Abuturn, and that one was painted in 1918. But again, we see the same characteristics as the African art and as we saw in the Picasso paintings: elongated heads, necks, arms, and torsos, hollow, almond-shaped eyes, and long, slender noses. These paintings are quite remarkable visual connections to an artistic tradition from the African culture. In fact, Modigliani was a sculptor earlier in his career, and we can see in this sculpture by him of a head that it's almost identical to the masks and sculptures of the African art in the display case. This head sculpture, by the way, is in the Barnes collection, just in a different gallery. Okay, so up to now, we've only seen galleries and ensembles on the second floor of the Barnes. We haven't been down on the first floor yet. And with just a few minutes left of this tour, I'd like to head downstairs and show you the mother of all galleries at the Barnes Foundation, or our main gallery. So here we are in the main gallery of the Barnes Foundation. We're looking at the north wall, and you get a good idea of the scale of this room by observing how high the ceiling is and the fact that you can see through those arches up to the balcony on the second floor. But let's zoom in and take a closer look at this wall. First, you might notice right away that there are a lot of Renoir paintings on this wall. In fact, it's all Renoir paintings with just a few paintings by Paul Cezanne. I like to think of this wall as the Renoir Shrine. But as we pan across the wall, we again see the beautiful symmetry with which Barnes arranges these pieces. The vertical canvases balancing the horizontal ones, the metalwork drawing visual connections to the brush strokes or the subjects in the paintings, the similarity of the color palette used in all the paintings. We could spend days just talking about the pieces on this one wall, but I'm going to focus on just one. This painting by Auguste Renoir. It's from his late period. It was finished in 1916, and it's titled Bathing Group. It's easy to conclude, after seeing all of these Renoirs, that Auguste Renoir was Dr. Barnes's favorite artist. But we actually know for a fact that this particular painting was Dr. Barnes's favorite Renoir. Dr. Barnes wrote in a letter once that he believed this painting was the summation of Renoir's powers. We see Renoir's exceptional use of color in this painting, the vibrant blues and greens, the remarkable use of impressionistic brushstrokes in the water, in the trees, the sky, and even the two small figures further back in the stream. And Renoir's beautiful rendering of flesh and flesh tones. I also think Barnes liked this painting because it's a new, fresh take on an old tradition in art, the traditional subject of Arcadia. Arcadia is a subject or a concept in art of a utopia or a paradise, a Garden of Eden, so to speak. You see paintings of Arcadia quite often from the Renaissance period or the Baroque or the Rococo or the Neoclassical periods, all with very similar themes or motifs. Young, beautiful people dancing and playing or listening to music, surrounded by nature that's untouched by human industrialization, plenty of food and drink, interacting with fauns and other mythological creatures. But Renoir takes a more modern, impressionistic approach to these Arcadian themes. We also see this with a couple other works that are located in this gallery. If we were physically standing in the gallery right now, I'd ask you to turn around and look behind you at the south wall. That large painting on the south wall, all the way up at the top, which looks like a mural, is called The Dance, and that's by Henri Matisse. This is the only piece in the collection that was specifically commissioned by Dr. Barnes. In 1930, when Matisse traveled to the US, he made a special trip to the Barnes Foundation since there were so many of his works here. During that visit, Barnes asked him if he would create a large painting to fill those lunettes that you see above the large windows. As I mentioned, it only looks like a mural. It's actually 3 separate large canvases, carefully measured and arranged together. Matisse, in fact, had to rent a garage in Nice, France, to complete these paintings because they were so large. But I think it's interesting how Matisse takes an even more modernistic approach to those Arcadian figures he included in this piece by abstracting and elongating them even more. But the way the figures are portrayed in a dance creates an easily recognizable visual connection and traditional relationship with that Renoir painting that we were just looking at. In fact, if we look a little closer, we can see that what I believe is a nod or a tip of the hat by Matisse to this Renoir painting. If we zoom into the figures on the right of the Renoir, we can see clearly that the figures on the left were most likely deliberately composed like that by Matisse to make a visual connection with the Renoir painting, which he may have also known was Dr. Barnes's favorite. Okay, finally in this gallery, if we were physically standing here, I'd ask you to now turn to your left and look at our east wall. There seems on this wall to be 2 anchor paintings, but I'd like to concentrate on the one at the top by the 4th member of our 4 pillars, Paul Cezanne. This was painted by Cezanne sometime between 1895 and 1906 and is simply titled The Large Bathers. Like the Renoir and the Matisse paintings, Cezanne creates his own modern interpretation of those Arcadian themes we talked about, but it's a much darker vision. Instead of bright, clear blue colors for the sky and a lush, colorful landscape, Cezanne uses dark blues to create a more ominous-looking sky. And the lack of color in the trees creates a barren landscape with dead or dying branches. Instead of the idealized female bodies in the Renoir, and more similar to the elongated bodies in the Matisse, Cezanne deliberately distorts the figures in this painting. He paints their flesh cold and marble-like with uneven strokes. He even obliterates the faces in a few of the figures, like the ones on the far left and the far right. Again, even though it's not written anywhere, I believe Dr. Barnes placed these 3 paintings on purpose in the same gallery so that viewers can compare and contrast them with each other and see the very different interpretations of the same themes by 3 different artists. Okay, so we only have time for one more stop on this tour, which is going to be right through this door in our Gallery 2. So let's go. We're looking right now at the north wall in Gallery 2, and I would like to end today by talking about one of the most popular and one of my most favorite paintings we have here in the collection. This beautiful portrait by Vincent Van Gogh. This painting was one of the original paintings that Glackens brought back to Barnes from that very first trip to Paris in 1912. It's a portrait of a man by the name of Joseph Roulin, who met Van Gogh when he moved to Arles, France in 1888. Van Gogh actually painted 6 portraits of Roulin, but we only have the one that's on the far left here. Van Gogh and Roulin were great friends, and Roulin was one of the only people who showed Van Gogh any genuine kindness during a time that was emotionally and financially very difficult for him. In fact, it was Roulin who cared for Van Gogh during his well-documented hospital stay in nearby Saint-Rémy. Van Gogh idealized Roulin, regarding him as both a man of the people and a sage. He described him in a letter once as a good soul and so wise and so full of feeling and so trustful. So it's easy to see why Van Gogh created so many portraits of this man. Now, Dr. Barnes cleverly hung this portrait at a level where you can look directly into the eyes of this gentleman and trusted friend. And when you do, you not only see Roulin through Van Gogh's eyes, you see Van Gogh himself. One of the reasons Impressionist and post-Impressionist artists met with so much resistance is because of the belief or standard at the time that you shouldn't see the artist in the brushstrokes. The paint should be applied in such a way without any hint of the artist's process. But the beauty of this painting is that you can see Van Gogh in the brushstrokes, in every single painstaking stroke, and in every color he so carefully applied to the face of his dear friend. Because of this, Van Gogh didn't just create a painting or a portrait of a man. He created something that would last forever, a bond between himself and this kind spirit who he never wanted to forget. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this tour today. It's been my pleasure to share it with you, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure I'm going to turn it back over to Colleen in just a few moments, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great. Thanks so much for that wonderful tour, Joe. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, so if anyone has questions, you can drop them in the art chat now. Joe, we did receive some wonderful questions throughout the tour. So we'll start off first with what happened to the original house and gallery in Marion, Pennsylvania?
Oh, that's a great question. So that house, the Arboretum, is still there. It's it is run by, or I guess we could say the tenants of that building right now is St. Joseph's University, who are caring for the property, but also using that original gallery and property as well to carry on Dr. Barnes's and Mrs. Barnes's a goal of botany and caring for the grounds there, as well as for some other events and uses at the school. So it is still there and being used by St. Joseph's University.
That's great. Did Barnes collect art first and then create the ensembles, or did he start creating ensembles and then collected specific art to fill out the ensemble? It's a great question.
That is a great question. Very observant. Actually, the extremely short answer is both. First, like I had mentioned in the tour, when he started receiving these works that at first Glackens brought back for him. And by the way, after that initial trip that Glackens made for Barnes, he immediately started taking trips himself over to Europe very frequently to purchase art there himself. He developed a very close relationship with Gertrude Stein, the Steins, and then later started collecting art here in America as well. But as he started trying to develop this method of how does it change the dynamic and the way I approach and view this art and creating these ensembles, he later would then sometimes go in search of pieces to maybe balance out a wall or ensemble. He famously would sometimes walk around Philadelphia at farmers markets or local artist markets where he would notice something by a completely unknown artist that he thought would go perfectly in a specific ensemble or on a certain wall, and he would purchase it for that reason. and they're still hanging on the wall today.
Awesome. Now, I'm not positive how much background about Picasso you know, but we did have this interesting question. Didn't Picasso deny African influence on his work? And it was only after his death that they were able to prove his exposure to African art. Do you have any insight?
I a little again. I'm not incredibly well versed with this, but I do think that Picasso was reluctant to talk too much about his process and his influence. Again, I can't cite a specific example, but I do know of several examples, having read certain things and watching certain documentaries, that I do know that he was reluctant to talk about his process and his inspiration for certain works. Like Barnes, I think Picasso wanted to leave it to the viewer to discover things and not over-explain the paintings too much.
Great.
Definitely worth
So,
looking into more, though. That's an interesting question.
yeah. Aside from Matisse and Glackens, did Dr. Barnes connect personally with other artists or artisans in his collection?
Yes, yes. There are so many artists. He didn't, of the four pillars. He didn't connect with Paul Cezanne individually. He dealt mostly with their their agents, their collectors, their representatives. But there were several artists in the collection that Barnes would deal with directly. Randall Morgan is an American artist that I'm studying a little bit more right now, that I know he had a direct connection with as well. But again, of the four pillars, Matisse, and yes, Matisse was the only artist that he had the direct connection with.
Great. And we do just have two more questions. Is the Barnes Foundation and the running of the museum still independent of other art organizations?
Yes. Yeah, as I mentioned in the beginning of the tour, the Barnes Foundation is, like I said, it was chartered as an educational institution, and it's very different from other art institutions in that the collection never changes. The pieces in the main collection, the permanent collection, are never loaned out. They never go on tour. We never bring additional pieces into the galleries. As I mentioned, the way Dr. Barnes left it at the time of his death in 1951 is the way the collection remains. In fact, during the move from Marion to Philadelphia, the whole design of the new building was to replicate that old building and kind of build out on top of it, so that there was additional spaces. But all of the art was measured down to just a couple millimeters, so that it's all displayed in exactly the same way. So yes, so the Barnes Foundation still operates primarily as an education institution with the classes that they offer, these tours, etc. And the collection itself never really changes.
Great. And our last question for this evening, are you aware of any other museums that have adopted the ensemble approach?
I'm not aware of any that adopt this approach to as Dr. Barnes displayed it. I have had people mention in other tours that it looks like everything is kind of displayed in what was known as the salon style. Anybody that has studied art, particularly in Paris and in France in the 19th century, knows that the the biggest event for art and artists was the Paris Salon every year. And at the time, if you didn't get into the Paris Salon as an artist, you were unknown and pretty much considered insignificant. So you had the Paris Salon was a rite of passage. But if you see drawings from the Paris Salon, you see that the art was displayed floor to ceiling. There was hardly an inch of wall space that was visible. So it was a very overwhelming display of the art. And some of the walls and the galleries in the barns, it seems like it has that Paris Salon uh, uh, method of displaying art. There are some galleries in Italy that I've been to that, again, there's just a lot of art displayed floor to ceiling, even on the ceiling. But again, Dr. Barnes had a very specific method for displaying this art, and it always changed. It was always being changed and moved around until the day he died. He just kept experimenting with things, and again, just to kind of build those relationships between the paintings and the other objects in the ensemble. So, no, that's what really attracted me to the Barnes a few years ago, and is that it's how unique this method is.
Yeah, great. Well, Joe, thank you again. Your tour is wonderful, and we appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you again to
Thank you.
Mercersburg Academy for joining us today. If you enjoyed this tour, consider studying art history or art appreciation from home. We're now offering a full array of online classes with new ones rolling out every month. Need-based scholarships are also available. In fact, there are many ways to support the Barnes, including becoming a member. Members enjoy privileges all year long, including unlimited free admission, access to special exhibition previews and private tours, discounts on classes and public programs, and reciprocal benefits at museums around the world. We offer a 10% discount on classes and membership for virtual tour attendees. Simply use the code virtual tour online or over the phone. Most importantly, your generosity provides vital support to the Barnes, making possible our innovative exhibitions and programming, critical conservation efforts, robust education initiatives, and wide-reaching community engagement activities. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to Jen Bradley.
So I just wanted to close by saying thank you again to Joe and Colleen and all who are behind the scenes at the Barnes Foundation for making this virtual tour possible. I also want to thank you all for spending some time with us on your Sunday afternoon or morning or early evening, wherever you're calling in from. And just encourage you to take a look at the other upcoming Mercersburg virtual events that we have. You can find a complete listing at mercersburg.edu/alumni-events. On February 9th, we'll be having a special session on the history of the Edwards Room with school archivist Doug Smith. So I highly encourage you all to look that up. But thank you again and have a wonderful long weekend.